Welcome to Moments with Marianne. I'm so delighted we're spending this time here today. We have a very inspiring show coming right up with special guest, Judithe Little, and she's here to share with us her new novel, The Chanel Sisters. So do you know about the bond of two sisters that changed fashion forever? Most people don't. This is a heartfelt story of survival, love, loss, and triumph. Now, many of you know Judithe. She's an award-winning author, and she earned her BA in Foreign Affairs from the University of Virginia and a law degree from the University of Virginia Law School. So let's welcome to the show, Judithe Little.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
What an honor it is to have you here to talk about this book. I've got to ask, what inspired you to write this book?
I was inspired once I learned that Coco-Chanel had a sister, Antoinette. I was reading a biography of her just for fun. And when I got to the part that mentioned the sister, for some reason it surprised me because I'd never really thought of Coco as having a family. And she just seemed like this kind of solitary, iconic person. And to me, the fact that she had a sister kind of humanized her. And I was really interested to know what it would have been like to be Coco-Chanel's sister. So I started researching Antoinette to see if there was a story there. And I found that there really was, and told the story from Antoinette's point of view, in their early childhood until it starts from 1897 and then it ends in 1921. So it's a snapshot of the earlier life of Coco and Antoinette and their life as sisters and how they interacted and how they managed to start what was the beginning of the Chanel empire that we know today.
I think when most people hear Coco Chanel, they think this glamorous woman who's just amazing and just beautiful, clothing. And it's interesting because I understand that she didn't really start off that way.
No, not at all. And that's exactly what I thought. I always imagined that she was born in Paris to a wealthy family, and that she, basically grew up with pearls around her neck. But the exact opposite was true. She was born in a poorhouse to an unwed mother in the middle of France. Her father was not around, and he was a ne'er-do-well sort of guy. He was never home, always traveling from market to market because he was a peddler of used goods, and they were pretty much a vagabond family with no permanent home and living hand to mouth. When Coco was 11 and Antoinette was 7, their mother died. She was in her early 30s. She died, and their father took the girls and left them on the doorstep of a convent orphanage in the middle of Aubazine, France, which is a very remote mountainous area. And he never came back for them. He said, that he would, but then they never saw him again. And they spent about 10 years as charity cases being raised by nuns in this convent orphanage, which ended up having a huge effect on Coco's life. Although it was something she never spoke about, she kept that a secret until the day she died. So that was another reason I wanted to tell the story from Antoinette's point of view, because Antoinette is a more reliable narrator, and Antoinette would understand why Coco wanted to keep this part of her past a secret and could sort of explain that to the reader and help the reader to understand why Coco did some of the things that she did.
My goodness, that's so interesting because that's just totally different than anyone would think about, the Chanel sisters. When you're doing your research, was there anything else that really surprised you?
There was one thing in particular that surprised me, which was that Antoinette played this great role in helping Coco start out. And that has been left out of most of Coco's biographies, and nobody today has heard of Antoinette. So I wanted to tell a lot of her story. but she was there when Coco first started selling hats. Coco was a late bloomer, and she didn't actually intend to be a fashion designer. That was not what she wanted to do. She wanted to be a star of the stage and sing and dance, but she didn't have the talent. And so she ended up selling hats as sort of a last resort, only because she would make hats for herself, because she didn't like the style of hats at the time, which were very large and overdone, with flowers and bird cages and all kinds of things. So she would make very simple hats for herself, and people would admire them and ask her where she got them. And then she started making them for her friends, and it ended up taking off into a business. And then she went from hats to clothing. And as she did all this, Antoinette was at her side when she first opened a boutique on the Rue Cambon in Paris. And then she opened another boutique in Deauville, and then a third one in Biarritz. And Antoinette was pretty much her right-hand woman, so to speak, all along that journey until 1921, which is when the Chanel brand and Coco really became famous and wealthy.
Oh my goodness. How impressive is that? It must have been really interesting to write from Antoinette's perspective. Did you find a lot of information on her?
It was really interesting. And there are a lot of gaps in what we know about Antoinette, which was a little bit difficult to fill in. I spent a lot of time trying to find as much as I could about her. I think in part, Coco didn't really talk about her past much or her family. So she herself left a big gap there. And the records of their convent orphanage, it's said that Coco had those destroyed because she, again, didn't want people to know that she came from a convent orphanage. And so there's certain things we know for sure about Antoinette and certain places. For instance, she was at the convent orphanage, and she did live in Vichy, France for a while. And then she was with Coco when she first started selling hats in Paris. There's a ledger book for the business that Antoinette signed on January 1st, 1910. And then Coco's life becomes a little bit more, because now she's more well-known and there are records of her and she can't lie about anything. It becomes a little bit easier to follow Antoinette from Paris to Deauville and then to Biarritz, where she ran the Biarritz store herself. But so what I had to do to find out about her, in addition to looking through the biographies of Coco, I looked at old census records from France, which was pretty fun to look through those because they are not typed in. They're actually scanned in pages from the original books. And it has all the beautiful handwriting of the time and the names and the professions. And so that was fun to do, although it took me a while because I couldn't just type in Antoinette Chanel and something would pop up. I actually had to go through page by page. And then I also looked at old French newspapers to see if I could find anything about them in those records. And I'm also in touch with some family members of Coco's and Antoinette's, some distant family members who were able to tell me a little bit about Antoinette's later life.
Oh my gosh, that is so interesting. So you spent time in France to research this?
I didn't specifically spend time in France to research it. I did live in France before I was researching the novel, so I was familiar with France. But thankfully, the census records are all online, and so I was able to do that from my home here. I started writing when my kids were young, and I think it was an escape in a way to have a little grown-up world that I could go to. And so I didn't really have the luxury of being able to leave and, tell my husband, hey, I'm going off to France to research a novel. So I've had to do most of my research from here, which has worked out well, thanks to the internet. And I've also used Google Earth to go to some of the places. For instance, I traveled, so to speak, to Milan, France, where the Chanel sisters lived for a brief time at another pensionnat, another school run by nuns. And I really wanted to know where that was in the city. And I knew they had walked from this pensionnat to Mass on Sundays. And I was curious to know what they saw when they walked, what they went by. So I had an idea of where it was located in Milan, but it doesn't exist anymore. And so I just started following on Google Earth the little arrows and going down the streets. And then I just ran basically right into the pensionnat, the doorway. And over the top, it said Pensionnat Notre Dame, which is where they were. And so that was pretty exciting for me. And then I was able to walk down the street and, see what they would have seen themselves on their way to Mass and get an idea of what the city, because I've never been to Milan, and what the city is like.
What a great time we live in where we can do things like that.
I know.
You can build this story from, I think it really inspires writers. If you can't travel to some of these places, you can, there's always a plan B.
I know. I think back to the days of having to go to the library to research, which I loved, always doing that. And, the smell of books and the excitement of finding a book. But if I had to do that, it would have taken me so much longer if I didn't have libraries, the access to libraries and other records online.
It must have been just really difficult to construct this story and also include World War II in it. I mean, there's so much going on.
There is a lot going on, and World War I was fun for me to research because I didn't know anything about it. I knew a lot about World War II. My first book takes place in the early years of World War II, but I really knew nothing about World War I. And so I had to learn about that and how different it was from World War II. And it played a huge role in Coco and Antoinette's life because the clothing that Coco made for herself was very comfortable clothing. It was clothing that she could move in. I think because she spent all those years locked up in a convent orphanage. Once she got out, she was ready to participate in life. And the styles of the time were corsets and long skirts and all kinds of layers and those enormous hats. And a woman had difficulty moving, let alone some couldn't even dress themselves. And Coco was having none of that. And she made her own clothing. She spent time in Deauville, which is where she opened her second boutique. And it was a resort town. She went there with her lover, Boy Capel. And she wanted to play tennis and she wanted to play golf. And, she was learning all these things. Of course, she had learned them when she was young at the convent orphanage. But she wanted to participate in all of that. And so she made the kind of clothes that would look good and stylish, but that she was also able to move about. And she even went swimming. She was one of the few at the time to go in the water in a swimsuit. So when World War I came along, it was a huge transition in the way women were able to partake in the world. Women were not just decorative anymore. Women had to do a lot of the jobs that the men who were off on the front used to do. And they also were volunteering at hospitals, and they needed the kind of clothing that Coco offered. And she was one of the few who actually offered that kind of clothing. So World War I was a huge boon to her business-wise, and she really just kind of got richer and richer as the years went by. And then, of course, the book ends in 1921, and after World War I, but society has completely changed then. And then Coco, who had been kind of on the outskirts of society because she was a tradeswoman up through the war, once war changed everything, that was when she became the Coco that we know of today and was more of a society type person. But before that, she would dress these ladies of the aristocracy and, chat and talk in her boutique. But then if they would pass each other on the street, the ladies would completely ignore her.
That is just insane when you think about that. And she was such a visionary, because when you talk about like changing women's clothing, I mean, women could get arrested if they were considered indecent, So I understand like the bathing suits of that time, they were made of wool and can weigh like 50 pounds. So women really weren't swimming a lot.
Yeah, it's funny and even if you look at the outfits that she made for herself that were easy to move around in, I think, today we would think that's not easy to move around in at all. But at the time, it was compared to what women had been wearing. So she just really kind of followed her instincts rather than following fashion or, what was in style at the time. I think in part too, because she was poor and she couldn't afford what was in style. So she, of necessity, had to come up with her own look. And that was what ended up making her so successful.
Yeah, that unique look that she had. And I understand she also changed how women wore their dresses too.
She did. Many women, they had the waist, the tiny little wasp waist, and the fuller figure, and Coco changed all that. Of course, she was a petite person, and she knew that she didn't look good in those kinds of styles at all, and she looked better in sort of the straight dress. But she really believed that a woman was more appealing when you could get a sense of her actual body under her clothes versus this distorted body that comes with the corset and everything being pushed up and sucked in. And so that was a huge change that she made in women's clothing. And she also made it so that you could get up in the morning and dress, and then you didn't have to think about it. I think she wanted women to be able to dress to live, not live to dress, as a lot of the designers at the time did. There was Paul Poiret, who was very costumey, and he, in fact, had women wearing what was called the hobble skirt. And so women were actually wearing a skirt that would hobble them, and that was fashion. And of course, Coco hated that.
I'm sure a lot of other women hated that too. So you think about some of the styles that, have been designed, and especially if a man's designing it and doesn't have to wear it, it's a whole different thing.
Yeah, that was one of her big things too. Is it upset her whole life, designs that men would come up with that to her, were inhibited a woman's ability to move. She did not like that at all. So she did not like anything that was too costumey. That's for sure.
Well, and so when you wrote this book, I know that a lot of times people either plan it out or they just sit down and write. How was it writing Antoinette? Was it something that was planned, or was it something that really kind of just flowed from you?
It was a little bit of both. Because it's historical fiction, there are certain things that are inherently planned, certain dates and times. But then with respect to some of the gaps in Antoinette's life that, there's just absolutely no evidence of certain parts of her life. Like, for instance, her love life, her early love life, there's no talk of that anywhere. And so that is something that I had to use what I knew about her and the facts of her life, and then try to logically extrapolate from there, what could have happened to her. So there was a lot of creativity that has to go into that. And I'm kind of funny because I love to write fiction, but I don't like to make anything up, which sounds kind of weird. But if it's historical fiction, I really want to know exactly what happened and what everybody said. Of course, it's impossible to know that. So there is that, that's why it's fiction, because we have to make those parts up. So there was, part of it that I had to write as I went along but I had a basic understanding, of course, of where the story was going to go and what was going to happen at certain times.
Well, that is so inspiring because I know people when they do research and find that one little nugget that they're like, oh my gosh, I need to build a story around this. It a lot of times they get a little confused on how they're going to go forward with that, so it's so good to hear how you do it.
Well, I think that's the $1,000,000 question. I mean, I still struggle with that, and I see other authors struggling with that, how to take an idea and turn it into a plot that keeps moving forward and that keeps a reader interested. I mean, it's every time an author sits down to write a book, I know that they struggle with that. It doesn't come easily, and everybody has their own methods. Some do the full outline and others don't.
Were there any themes that ran throughout the book for the reader that they would pick up?
One theme was the sense of home and the sense of place, because Coco and Antoinette never really had a home growing up. And so it was kind of the idea of what is a home. And, the convent orphanage, I don't think they would have considered home. And then Coco lived with one of her lovers at his chateau that was his home. Antoinette never really had her own home. And what I think became their home was the boutique on the Rue Cambon. That was really, in the end, a home for them. And it's still there, which is pretty interesting. So home was definitely one of the themes. And then another theme was the place of women and how women can rise up out of poverty, which is what Coco and Antoinette had to do. At the time, there were limited opportunities for people to change their class, their socioeconomic class. And for women like Coco and Antoinette, who were at the very bottom, two of those were to be a star of the stage, which is what Coco wanted. And another was to become a mistress of a wealthy man. A wealthy man would never marry someone from their class, but he would take a mistress. And there were a lot of famous mistresses at the time who were almost celebrities in Paris, and they would collect their pearls and diamonds and jewels from their lovers. And then if they were smart, they would save those and use them as kind of a 401k plan. So one of the themes was how women can rise above all that. And Coco and Antoinette ended up doing it their own way, which was by starting a business. And they were really modern in that sense, because most people had not done that. Most women had not done that at that time.
Yeah, they're so bound by class. Getting beyond that is almost impossible. And it's interesting just how far women have come.
It really is. I've had some people say that, well, of course, Coco, or at least I think in our modern thinking, we might think, well, Coco knew from a young age that she was going to be a fashion designer and that, she had talent. And I think it's kind of comforting to people now. I mean, my kids are older now and they're in college, and they're all so stressed about, we have to know exactly what we're going to do in life. And, Coco didn't at all. She really floundered for a long time trying to figure out, who she was going to be and how she would take care of herself. And so that's interesting to me. And I'm glad to let people know that, it's not always as easy or as this straight and narrow path that we all might think that it is.
Kind of seems to take a life of its own, and you're just kind of writing where it follows.
Yeah, I mean, I learn a lot when I write. I learned a lot about Coco that when I started writing, and Antoinette that when I started, I had no idea about. Like, for instance, I figured out that the reason she lied about her past, about the convent in particular, was because she was so hurt by the fact that her father had abandoned them. And if she admitted that she was raised in a convent orphanage, then that would be admitting that her father had abandoned her and having to revisit that, which was so painful to her. So she did, because she made up her own story, and it wasn't a glamorous story. She said that she was raised by old maid aunts in the countryside, which is a kind of her telling of the nuns in Aubazine, France. But she left out the orphanage part, and that was what was so hurtful to her. But it took me, writing the novel to finally realize that that was why she would lie about that part of her past. It wasn't because she was trying to pretend to be someone she wasn't. It was because of that. I think that was one of the most defining things that had ever happened to her in her life.
Yeah, she is just so wounded from that as a child being abandoned that it just really, I could understand that being a very difficult thing.
It really was, and it drove so much of what she did. She saw from her parents, literally from her mother dying, that you can't count on anybody else to take care of you because her father was never around. And so she just had this primal need to be independent and to take care of herself financially, which she did her entire life. She, at one point later, this doesn't happen in the book because this is later in the 20s, she dated for 10 years the richest man in England, and she still worked and she still put on her collections, and she, worked very, very hard, even though she could have relied on him with all of his money, but she couldn't do it.
Well, and I understand that we actually hit the 50th year that Coco has passed away, which, that was in January, and just how interesting, how much has changed during that time.
I know, it's amazing how much has changed. And I think it's interesting if you look at the designers for Chanel who have come after her, they still stick with her aesthetic for the most part. They still use the colors and the kinds of fabrics that she always used. So I love seeing that because a lot of that comes from, again, her convent orphanage past, where they used kind of these nubby woolen fabrics, and the lines were very simple and also very modest. Her clothing was always very modest. And it's funny because of all the people that she was competing against back in her day, we really don't remember any of them, but we do remember Coco-Chanel, and it's still a symbol of luxury and a brand that people still want, which is amazing.
Well, I just absolutely loved your book, The Chanel Sisters. Where can people connect with you, Judith, and be part of your community?
I'm on Facebook at Judith with an E Little, and I'm also on Instagram, which is also at Judith with an E Little. And then I also have a website, judithelittle.com. And so any of those three places, you will be able to find me. And on Instagram, I do post fairly regularly photos and other information that are from my research of the Chanel sisters.
That's pretty exciting because there's only so much that can go into a book, right?
Yeah. Well, and a lot of photos were inspiration for parts of the book, but of course, a fiction, you don't have the photo pages like you would in nonfiction. Yeah.
Well, Judith, thank you so much for taking the time to be on the show with us here today.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you, Judith. It has been such an honor to spend this time with you and to talk about your new book, The Chanel Sisters. The Chanel Sisters is a perfect read for this summer, so make sure to pick up a copy. It's available at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and all indie retailers. And if you don't see it on the shelf, ask for them to order it. And of course, you want to support our indie bookstores. Again, if you'd like to connect with Judith, you can at judithelittle.com for more information. Well, we're at the end of our time today. I would like to thank everyone for tuning in. You're listening to Moments with Marianne. And remember, make every moment count.
In a single moment, your life can change. Moments with Marianne is a transformative hour that covers an endless array of topics with the best of the best. Her guests are leaders in their fields, ranging from inspirational authors, top industry leaders, and business and spiritual entrepreneurs. Each guest is gifted and a true visionary, a recognized leader in her own work, and while teaching others to develop, refocus, and grow, Marianne will bring the best guest and sometimes a special surprise. Don't miss this. You never know just which moment will change your life forever. Moments with Marianne airs every Sunday, Monday, Thursday, and Friday at 8 p.m. Eastern and 5 p.m. Pacific Time. Make sure to tune in and visit momentswithmarianne.com for more information.